So I think we can wait a few minutes now just to let the participants filter through, and so maybe we could start in a minute or two. Okay, I think we can start now. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this event on media freedom that's been organized by the European Policy Centre to discuss how a transatlantic relationship can help address regional challenges in the Western Balkans. This policy dialogue is part of a Transatlantic Challenges event series that the EPC organizes in cooperation with the US mission to the EU. My name is Perle Petit. I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Centre as part of the European Politics and Institutions Programme, and I'll be moderating this online event titled Pressing for Change, the State of Media Freedom in the Western Balkans. So to briefly introduce the topic and our events, we're here today, a day ahead of the International World Press Freedom Day, to discuss the situation of media freedom and plurality in the Western Balkans, where the situation has been increasingly deteriorating in line with worsening levels of media freedom globally. Across the Western Balkans, we see that independent media is consistently under pressure with censorship, undue government influence and interference on media outlets, attacks and threats against journalists, a lack of protection of media workers, repressive legal mechanisms such as slaps that are enforced by co-opted institutions, media monopolies, intransparent ownership of media, limited access of information, economic pressure, etc., etc. There's still a lot more of these other problematic mechanisms that are being used. Today, we will be discussing the challenges that are faced by media and independent journalists in the region, the connection between media freedom and rule of law concerns, and how these relate to overall democratic fundamental rights. We'll be looking particularly at the prospects for overcoming such hurdles to get to the regional's transatlantic integration on track. And also we'll be looking at the role that the EU and the US can play together in promoting higher media standards, particularly given the strong influence the US still has in the region and the need to rekindle EU-US cooperation in promoting democracy. So with us here today, we have an excellent panel of speakers. Please join me in welcoming Dragan Stavljanin, a journalist from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I apologize for my pronunciation. Marija, Śajkaš, an expert on freedom of expression, safety of journalists, and the state of media in the US and the Balkans. Mike Smeltzer, senior research analyst for Europe and Eurasia at Freedom House. And so we have here today a change of speaker. We originally had Dragana Obradovic, who was supposed to be with us, but unfortunately she wasn't able to come. But very luckily for us, her colleague Tanja Maksic has kindly stepped in and is joining us instead. So Tanja is a media policy expert and a program coordinator at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. So a very big welcome to all of our speakers, and thank you very much for agreeing to speak at this event. So briefly to describe the agenda, this will be an interactive conversation between our speakers, starting with a short initial input by each speaker. So this will be around 6 to 7 minutes each. And I would kindly ask our speakers to try and stick to this time limit, because I know the topic is very important. There's a lot to say, but so that we can get through all of our questions, 6 to 7 minutes would be perfect if possible. These initial remarks will reflect on the speaker's general assessment of the state of media freedom and the key areas of concern, and hopefully if and how these concerns can be addressed. After this, at around 4 o'clock, I'll be opening up the floor to our audience for a Q&A session. So I'd like to use this opportunity to mention to our participants, so our audience, that you can already start posing questions to our speakers via the Q&A function. So please keep these questions concise to the point, and if possible, please include your name and affiliation, if you don't want to be anonymous, of course. And if your question is also directed to a particular speaker, you can also mention that as well, so I can direct the question straight to them. So all of these questions will be collected, and then during the Q&A session, I will then read them to the particular speakers that they're addressed to. So I've been talking for a while now, so I'm going to pass it to our participants. And to kickstart this conversation, I will now pass the floor to Mike for his initial remarks about the general assessment, etc., of the state of media freedom. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Pearl. And just a huge thanks to the European Policy Center for the invitation to this important discussion. I think it's great that we're all meeting on the eve of World Press Freedom Day, because it gives us an opportunity to set the agenda and to really set the stage for an important day to highlight a region, frankly, that needs more attention and aid, particularly with regard to press freedoms. And so, as Pearl said, I work for Freedom House, which is one of the oldest international pro-democracy organizations of its kind in the US. And we were established in 1941, and we've advocated for freedom and democracy around the world. And by doing this, we do research on kind of the state of democracy throughout the world. I work on a project called Nations in Transit, which looks at the democracy, kind of state of democracy in the region stretching from Central Europe to Central Asia, and that includes the Western Balkans. And we focus on the institutional factors of democratic resilience. So how institutions provide, protect, and support the fundamental freedoms that we all care about. And of course, one of those institutions is the media. In our report, we ask these questions about the current state of press freedom through asking things about libel laws, harassment of journalists, editorial independence, the financial viability of the press and the independent media, and the functioning of public media. And we're going to talk about the specifics of what our analysis shows and what the other panelists know about what's going on in the region. But I think it's just important to take a step back and really ask this question of why media is important for democracy. I think for those of us that follow this very closely, either through the work that we do in journalism, or in my case, depending on the work that the journalists do, it's really clear what the connection is between free and independent media, free expression, and democracy. But I think for many people, and I know this from my own conversations with people in the region, in the Western Balkans, as well as here in America, that this connection is kind of less obvious, right? That when they look out and see all the challenges posed to and by a free press, they ask, well, why do we even need a free press? Isn't it better to have it controlled by the government? And so I think we really need to get back to the basics of making that fundamental case of why an independent and free media is so vastly important in a democracy, and rebuilding that institutional and societal trust between the media and the public. And we'll talk more about that. But in functioning democracies, right, it's so important to remember that the media provides the information to the public. It mediates between the public, citizens, and their politicians, and really serves as a watchdog, uncovering these abuses of power and forcing these institutions to correct their course, right? We have all these institutions that are supposed to check each other, the judiciary and the executive branch, the parliament, they're all supposed to check each other, but increasingly they're not, particularly in this region. And so it's the media that has this critical job of just providing a check on everybody. I mean, it's a monumental Herculean task that journalists have these days. And without the accurate information that these journalists are providing, citizens can't make these informed democratic decisions about who's going to represent them and who's going to lead them. And so without a strong, vibrant, independent media sector, we really have these corrupt and autocratic actors throughout the region and throughout the world that are just benefiting themselves in the shadows. And so even in contexts where we have a diverse set of media, it's often we see these media captured by political and economic elites. And so the information that's being provided is less than credible, less than accurate, and in many cases can inflame social tensions, which I'm sure we can talk about more. And the methods that the media is fighting against are just numerous. Pearl has already mentioned all of the ways in which the challenges that the media has to deal with, from the financial viability and this issue of media concentration, where we often see economic elites buying up and divvying up the media market, which in turn damages the editorial independence of these outlets and changes for the worse the perception of the media amongst the public. But then you have all these external challenges, right? You have the government influence, the foreign interference, disinformation, harassment of journalists. And so even if you have the most diligent and faithful journalists working, which we do in this region, the state and non-state actors are just trying to stymie the important investigative work. And we've already mentioned SLAPP laws. We also have these increasing laws that hamper government transparency and freedom of information requests. I mean, you can kind of go outside this region and look at places like Hungary, where the Orbán government is now using spyware to target the mobile devices of journalists. And it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that this could be used or is being used in the Western Balkans. And so I've already used up almost all my time and haven't gotten to the solutions at all. So I'm hoping that we can keep this conversation going, but I'm just really glad that we're all here to talk about this and that we can discuss some of the policy recommendations, because we recognize that the EU and the US have a role to play here with the public of these countries. Even if the political actors don't want to play ball and play by the rules of democracy, we recognize that the EU and the US need to work with the public to promote the region's media freedom. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And I'm sure we're going to have more time to go into this afterwards, so don't worry. And now I'll pass it straight to Marija for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. Hello, everyone. My name is Marija Śajkaš. I am a journalist, researcher, policy analyst based in New York, originally from former Yugoslavia. So Mike spoke generally about the phenomenon in such eloquent way, and I will try to bring it to the Western Balkans. So the general media situation in the Western Balkans until pretty recently was quite bleak, I think. These were, as Mike mentioned, captured countries ruled by stabilocrats. So people with autocratic strikes who were allegedly ensuring stability of the region, where in effect they were mostly corrupt and perpetuating conflict. My sense is that with political changes in North Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and the situation seems to be improving some. And this is evident not only by us talking with our colleagues on the ground, but then also through measurements such as, the used by Freedom House or Reporters Without Borders, where we see that actually those three countries are I think, going up on the measurement scales, while the rest of the region is either where it was or it's sinking down. Still some worrying transparencies throughout the region. Luckily, we no longer have a journalist in prison, which was the case with Jovo Martinović fairly recently in Montenegro. But for instance, not a single killing of a journalist in the Western Balkans came to the meaningful conclusion. In Serbia, there is currently trial going on, and it's in its 7th year for the murdered journalist Slavko Ćuruvija. People advocates in Serbia are paying close attention, and I also hope that international community will pay more attention to the verdict which we are awaiting, and this will hopefully be the first resolved case of those. In case of Duško Jovanović from Montenegro, Milan Pantić and Ada Vujasinović from Serbia, their fates remain unsolved, unresolved. And that's the situation actually with many other journalists who were murdered or kidnapped, murdered in the conflicts of former Yugoslavia. We sadly don't know anything, or mostly anything about it, or it's not recognized in a way it should. Due to extraordinary threats, a couple of journalists had to flee the Balkans in the recent couple of years. Not all of them are open about it. We have one who actually speaks vocally of it. It's Marko Vidojković from Serbia. He had to relocate recently due to enormous, threats, harassments, problems that he incurred in his journalistic work. Just shortly, he was almost daily, constantly threatened online. His photos were turned into memes, which suggests that that was organized, organized event into targeting him. He was labeled by politicians. He occurred many lawsuits, so slaps in his case, and he was also, for instance, at that time Minister of Police publicly said that people like Marko should go to jail. So just an illustration what's going on in the region. The annual human rights report published by the State Department, which is another useful tool to assess what's going on in the region in terms of media and human rights, confirms years after years that it's actually it's our politicians, it's our stabilocrats who are targeting the journalists or independent media. And when that happens, that then opens up the doors for torrent in some cases of attacks and problems. Smear campaigns, another interesting tool perfected in Serbia, I think. The way they work is, let's say a politician, a prominent establishment figure targets a journalist. That gets published in some cases in tabloids in Serbia, then repeated in morning shows on TVs with national frequencies, then in some cases turned into a special programming on daily news, and then it goes, or it's already on the web, and we have the entire circle of like really blanketed attacks. The situation for female journalists is even harder, I would argue. Western Balkans is patriarchal environment, and the only reason why we actually have more journalists, women in journalism, is because the profession doesn't pay well. So, who will do it? Women will do it. With my colleagues, Jennifer Adams and Bojana Kostic, I recently completed actually a research looking into situation in newsrooms throughout the Balkans. We can talk in detail about it, but women are mostly workforce, not decision makers still. They are perceived as weaker sex. They are accessory in many cases. And when they are attacked, that's usually twofold. They are attacked as, journalists, but also on the basis of their gender. Practically, that means that my colleagues, male colleagues, are when targeted, and many, brave journalists are targeted on daily basis. They are often told that they are spies, or they're close to Soros, or they work for Americans, which is okay. It's a label, but almost like a dignified label. Whereas my female colleagues are whores, prostitutes, should be raped until they bleed, and so on and so on. I mean, you got a picture. In conclusion, throughout Western Balkans, media is polarized. In many cases, we don't know the true owners of it. Journalists practice self-censorship in fear of attacks and of losing job. The media income often depends on government grants and advertising, and the media landscape is further complicated by influences coming from Russia, from China, and increasingly from Hungary. With this, I would conclude. And yes, media in the Balkans definitely need helps, all the help we can provide for them. And I welcome conversation about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll be going into how exactly there can be help and support given in these contexts, which are very sad and difficult situations. And so now I will pass to Dragan for your first comments.
Do you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. I do apologize first for my health problem, but this is something beyond my reach. Thank you for inviting me. I was glad listening to previous predecessors. First, I would say, as a journalist since 1985, almost 40 years, witnessing on the spot major events and processes in the Balkans in 80s, in 90s, and later on covering them sort of from distance here in Prague. I have to admit that the media situation has not improved substantially in the last few decades. On the contrary, and as Dunja Mijatović, at the time OSCE representative on freedom of the media, warned in 2015, freedom of the media in the Balkans is worse even after the wars in 90s. And the question is, why is that? So to understand what's going on and why the media situation now is so grim, and what needs and what's possible to be done in the future, we need to step back. Apart from the common problems which have troubled the media in all post-communist societies, the Balkan media, particularly in Serbia, is still tormented by the ever-present legacy of their role during the wars. following the breakup of former Yugoslavia. And part of the media served as a pure propaganda tool, which even nowadays denies a reckoning of Balkan societies with their recent past. Unfortunately, many media in the Balkans even now ratchet up the rhetoric of unsettled ethnic accounts, which definitely cannot contribute to the reconciliation among once warring nations. So the role of the media is often reduced to constant manufacturing instead of playing the role of fourth estate, being public sentinel, guardian, watchdog, rather being a lapdog, actually. The most striking shortcomings in the Balkans are the lack of independence of media, regulatory bodies, non-transparent ownership, the impact of politics on the media, underdeveloped media market, and so on and so on. And I would focus on the paradox of media transition in the Balkans, which could explain a lot of current problems. The privatization of media has been envisaged as a pillar of the overall media transformation. So the essence of the idea was that it would lead to the ejection of the state as the owner. Hence, the media would be rid of political influence. However, instead of getting rid of Leviathan or alienated state power, the proliferation of media has been supplanted by the concentration in the hands of few larger conglomerates. Kind of oligarchization, I would say, is at stake, as it case here in the Czech Republic with Andrej Babiš, the former Czech Prime Minister, kind of Czech Berlusconi. So the privatization of media has not been transparent. The Serbian government anti-corruption council concluded in the 2011 survey that the real owners of 18 out of 30 analyzed nationwide media outlets are not known. The reason is that primarily the presence of offshore companies in the media ownership structure is very important for now functioning. So the key goal of these offshore companies owned by members of the Nouveau Riche, who amassed their fortune during the tumultuous 1990s in a murky way, is to promote their various businesses, exerting pressure on competitors, pushing their own political agendas, or providing services to the political establishment aimed at extracting concessions in return. In that way, a kind of informal unholy alliance of politicians and businessmen has been formed. So it facilitated the media control by authorities. So, for example, for that reason, all TVs with national frequency in Serbia are now firmly under authorities' control. No other media like N1 or others could get a frequency, national frequency. So it led to another paradox, that media being sunk by market censorship. It is ironic that the independent media in the Balkans, which resisted years of dictatorship, could not survive with quotation democracy. They withstood the crackdown and censorship of the wartime regime thanks to the huge financial assistance by international donors, but were eventually sunk by market censorship. Two examples. The issue of Belgrade-based B92 is the most striking example of the paradox of media transition. Once Milosevic was toppled, international donors mostly withdrew their support, and B92 was forced to find its fortune in the unregulated media market. As a result, B92 could not sustain the market. The similar fate faced the famous Croatian weekly Feral Tribune. The tabloid media, particularly in Serbia, are mostly linked with hidden ownership by tycoons, which has led to the tabloidization of Serbian society overall. Tabloidization does not boil down mostly to celebrities, as is in the case in the regulated market worldwide, but rather to politics in general. In doing so, tabloidization is all-encompassing trends because the tabloid media are dragging targeted persons through the mud, and their campaign amounts very often to the lynching of opponents. So there are democratic, with quotation, and legal means to pressurize media. So ruling elites have at their disposal various very effective measures to stifle the media through different budgetary payments, because the state is the biggest provider of payments, around, let's say, 20-25, maybe even 40% in Serbia, imposing taxes, arbitrary financial inspections, withholding or the advertising, as well as the imposition of draconian defamation laws. So it leads to self-censorship, because journalists find themselves in a green situation in terms of their personal and financial security. So notwithstanding generous political promises about media freedom, media independence is being mostly hollowed out. And to conclude, with the role of the West, particularly the European Union, I would call it a kind of the EU complicity. So apart from the illusion that the media privatization would lead to a greater diversity and more media freedom, the EU fostered another illusion. While sending tepid messages about the importance of democratic values, it appears that the EU is poised for the sake of its overarching goals of striking an ethnic and geopolitical balance in the very fragile Balkans to trump concerns about fundamental freedoms. First of all, with Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić in an attempt to cut a deal on Kosovo, even though he cracks down on the media and brands investigative journalists as a scam. So as a result, the media under the control of authorities contributes pretty much to the dramatic decline of enthusiasm of Serbian citizens for the EU integration. For the first time in the last 20 years, less than 50% of Serbian citizens support the EU integration. Why is that is another question. We can speak about that. At the same time, the media fosters pro-Russian feelings with more than 80% of citizens supporting the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So for that reason, if we are speaking about how the EU and the United States could increase their support, they need to reconsider certain mistakes from the past and to see how to be more present in the completely different environment in the Balkans, or pretty much different the environment than it was during 90s, when Russia and China were pretty much absent compared to their now very active role there. So I conclude with this remark and be open for the questions later on.
Okay, thank you very much, Dragan. And now I will pass to Tanja.
Well, hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. Of course, thank you for having me here and for inviting me. I work for the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. I'm specialized in tracing media policies, but our organization is also running one small investigative center. We have investigative journalistic portal, and I can maybe shed a little bit more light about what does it feel and how does it feel to work in this media environment in Serbia. As my predecessors several times already pointed out, the especially bleak situation in Serbia, maybe I could shed a little bit light about what does it feel, what does it look like when you have to work in such a captured media system, and what's the autonomy of this capture. So maybe we can discuss about it a little bit later and how to deal with it. So the first thing, several times mentioned already, is that we work under strong authoritarian system for more than a decade now, and they basically took complete control over mainstream media, which means that they have full control over the information flow, public discourse, and public agenda, which not only reflects on media freedoms, which are constantly in decline, as already said, but it also affects other citizens' rights and freedoms. Colleague here from the Freedom House, he knows much more than me, but our country is labeled as partially free now, basically hardly providing the basis of electoral systems and failing in many other aspects in democratization. Reporters Without Borders constantly point out the decline in media freedoms. Transparency International Corruption Perception Index also quite worrying, pointed out to systemic corruption in almost all sectors in Serbia. As already mentioned, slow in EU integration process actually reflects all of these problems. Another thing that I would like to point out is basically the complete failure of business models of media, which means that media are now not run as healthy, stable financial operations, which also provide critical information for the citizens, but they are rather part of the clientelistic relations, and their owners are mostly there to either guard their primary businesses or are part of the overall political agenda and are in support of this agenda. Allocation of public funds, as already mentioned by Dragan, is also one of the important mechanisms of control and what we call soft censorship. Basically, our country in all levels of government, national and local, is allocating some 15 million euros through so-called project co-financing mechanism. These are the budgetary money that are going to the media sector. And basically what our research shows, and we have been following this mechanism for years now, is that the money and the access to this money is actually exclusively allowed to the pro-government or propagandistic media, even tabloid media, who are basically ruining the ethical and professional standards on daily basis, are also getting part of this budgetary money. What we also see is a problem with vertical concentration as well. So basically, and especially in TV market, cable TV market, we see basically some sort of duopoly between private SBB funds and telecom, which is state-run telecommunication operator. These operators not only run infrastructure, but they also now have their own media outlets, and they're very much in control and influence of the entire media sector, but before all, the TV and the cable TV. Digital space is also sometimes seen as the only space where some sort of independent information could be heard. Our portal is also functioning exclusively online, so we rarely have access to national TV or other mainstream traditional media. But I also have to point out that this space is not always favoring quality information, critical information, but rather supports the viral clickbait information that it favors the algorithm rather than public information. I would also have to say that this is the place where majority of this information is created, where our ruling party has its own armies of bots and trolls who are constantly working to influence the agenda that is created online. And in conclusion, I would like to point out that all of these problems that we are facing actually puts journalistic profession in very deep crisis. Its watchdog role is highly compromised. Professionalization standards in reporting are enormously declining. Ethics of reporting also quite problematic. Safety of journalists, working condition of journalists are also in decline, and as my previous speakers pointed out, the bleak situation in the majority of the newsrooms. So I would like to stop here and maybe to open the floor for the discussion. And of course, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to reply.
Thank you very much for that, Tanja. And so we've touched on quite a few topics already, including media ownership, media capture, safety of journalists, legal repression, disinformation, etc. But I thought perhaps we can zoom out a little bit for the first question that I'd like to pose to all of our speakers, and to ask about how media freedom trends in the Western Balkans fit into this broader media trends across Europe? And as a second part to this question, to ask what role should the EU and the US play in promoting media freedom, and in what ways can they cooperate in promoting higher media standards in the region? So I thought I would ask this question first to Dragan to hear some responses, and then we can pass around the panelists to see how you think of this problem.
First part of the question, if I understood well, if you see the situation in Hungary or in Poland or Bulgaria, just from the example of operation of my company, in 2003, several services, language services, operating or programming for the countries which were supposed at the time to join the EU in 2004, meaning Slovakia, Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, was closed down because according to the internal rules, we are not supposed to broadcast to the members of the EU. And fast forward 2 or 3 years ago, we reintroduced our programs to Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. And needless to explain why is that, because of corruption, rampant corruption and the political influence over the media, political situation, populism, and so on, so on, so on. So unfortunately, what's going in the Balkans is quite negative, and this ethnic burden is something additional, and the situation is very bleak. But I have to say, even seeing the situation here in the Czech Republic, I mentioned Andrej Babiš, unfortunately, the problem with the media, the media freedom is definitely declining worldwide. And why is that? Because maybe we have a kind of illusion that media as a fourth estate is a power itself, is the agent of change. But we need to understand that media is just a part of the system, and the media is very often rather agent of status quo than being agent of change. Not to go into details, we now have a problem with what's the truth, how to establish truth. As Friedrich Nietzsche once cynically said, there is no facts, there are just interpretations. So that means that different information could interpret, or better to say, misinterpret. And now ordinary people, find quite difficult to distinguish what's the truth from the lie. And the same information can be contextualized in different ways and to have a different meanings, particularly with the now new social medias and so on, but not to go into this. About the role of the EU and the United States. I mentioned this kind of illusion. Tanja remember very well how the EU was very persistent in pushing the Serbian authorities. At the time, it was pro-European forces in 2000 to privatize local media, means on the level of municipalities. And I know from the example of my birth town, my born town in the Western Serbia, how in several municipalities actually privatized media fall kind of prey to criminals. Real criminals who are now using this first for commercialization and for programming the lowest, something which is intellectually very low, and at the same time in the service with the authorities when they need to blast the opponents and so on and so on. So what I'm trying to say, the EU should have been more cautious in pushing privatization. No doubt that state is not a good owner of the media, but it needs to be cautious. But now when we are in this situation, I think that the situation cannot be repaired by making slight changes in this law and that law, introducing that law, sending a kind of assistance, financial, and this and that. I think that the problem is in its core. And the core is how to push, in this case, Serbian authorities to stop, stifling media, not to make kind of turning blind eye for the sake of kind of what's understandable in this situation with the war in Ukraine, that you need to have a Balkans calm in terms of not having new ethnic disputes. But you cannot do this, at the expense of basic freedoms, including media freedom. So more specifically, given the fact that apart from Croatia and Slovenia, which are already part of the EU, other countries are aspirant, and all of them, including Serbia, their aim is to join the EU at a certain point. And the EU has to be very clear and to push these countries and to put as a kind of priority that media freedom and independence of media needs to be a precondition for their coming closer to the EU and eventually be full member of the EU. Any kind of turning blind eye and for the sake of other issues, it would. That's the reason why, among others, we are in the situation that we are stuck. As I said, I am from 1985 journalist, and I have to say that I remember before Milosevic came into power in 1807, that journalists at that time socialist one party Yugoslavia are more free than now, more free. Believe me. This is not nostalgia for that time, but this is really when I see my colleagues in Serbia. Some of them very brave, doing very important job for the miserable amount of money and being subject to different kind of pressures, threats, and so on. They are in very dire situations. So what I'm trying to repeat, so it's not possible to change with a slight changes here and there with this law and that improvement and that assistance to this website or this investigative. We need to, the basic need is to change dramatically environment, political environment. Of course, it's not going to be changed overnight, but what the EU and the United States has as a kind of leverage is to push hard and to put as a priority a substantial and genuine, deep political reform, which includes reforms in the media sector.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dragan. And I'd like to pass the same question on to Mike now to hear your response about this.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a good question, kind of trying to understand how the Western Balkans fits into this broader region. As all the other panelists have said, you know, these machinations that we're seeing in the Western Balkans are evident elsewhere. And in fact, I think you could argue that they have a dispersing effect, right? Dragan was talking about the privatization of local media and how it's been bought up by, you know, local criminal actors. Well, we see this in Hungary, where it's bought up by, you know, national criminal actors in the ruling regime. And so a lot of these things that are happening in the Western Balkans are evident elsewhere, whether it be in Hungary, in Slovenia and Czechia, or whether it be even like in the Caucasus, in Georgia, where you have, you know, media markets being bought up by basically oligarchs. And thus you have a media market that is diverse, but it's diversely owned by economic elites who push their own political and economic agenda. And so it's reliable, but it's reliable in that it's reliably biased in one way or the other. And so we're seeing a lot of these same things throughout the region. One thing I'd like to go back to actually is this point that Marija made, which I thought was really interesting about, you know, it's not all bad news. We are seeing some positive trends in the region. And I think Kosovo is like a really interesting example, right? Where you do see sort of the government pulling back a little bit on its kind of control of the media. And you saw the government participated in this kind of journalist in residence program in which it was organized by sort of international and local media organizations where they hosted journalists from Ukraine who were fleeing the war, as well as some journalists from Afghanistan, right? This is a fantastic project. But at the same time, we still need to see that support for local media freedom happen in the country, right? And it gets connected to these broader issues that they're dealing with domestically. So you can take, you know, the conflict in the Serb majority north, where Kosovo journalists who were reporting on the blockades were attacked. They had rocks thrown at them, and so even where there's these positive strides made, it's very much either a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or sometimes a 1 step forward, 1 step back. And so I don't want to paint the picture as bleak throughout the region. I think Dragan is right that things are particularly heinous in Serbia right now. We can point to things that are happening in Albania with how like the tax authorities are going after various media outlets. that they perceive as critical of the government. And so this gets to the question of, well, what do we do about this? And I don't want to paint a very hopeless picture. I do think there are things that can be done. And as Dragan said, the EU integration process is part of that. It's broken. He's right. It's very broken, and it's leaving a lot of people disillusioned, which has all of these sort of effects that kind of trickle out into all of the institutions. But I think there are like concrete things that can be done. So one of these issues that has come up is this, like, who owns these media, right? We don't know often, and so more stronger laws about beneficial ownership transparency, right? We need to know who owns these medias, both in terms of kind of domestic influence, but as well as foreign influence. You can think about, Russian influence in many of these places. But I think Dragan also made an interesting point that throwing money at this problem is not going to be the solution, that there need to be creative ways to do this. And in fact, the assistance provided to many of these countries has, as Marija said, kept these stableocracies in power for many years. And there needs to be a rethinking to kind of drive bottom-up change, particularly in the media sector. And so we can think about, how are journalists collaborating across borders to address these transnational issues of SLAPP laws. They're everywhere. They're in Bosnia, they're in Albania, they're in Serbia, they're in Hungary. And there is this coalition against SLAPPs in Europe, right? That we should find more ways for these journalists to kind of come together to figure out what's the best way to handle these, to provide, funds for the legal funds, basically, to deal with these problems. And then, there's also these broader international projects like the International Fund for Public Interest Media. They are this kind of multi-stakeholder initiative that's designed to address these challenges in what we would call like partly free countries at Freedom House. And currently it's providing, these initiatives in Ukraine and Moldova, but I think it's time for these to move into the Western Balkans to provide aid and support there, and to really fund these, not things at like a level that keeps kind of the political elite in power and continues this cycle that Dragan is talking about, but that really gets to the core and the basis of, local journalists and helping them, fight back against these corrupt individuals at the elite and helping them do the important investigative work that they're doing. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Mike. And I just thought that I forgot to mention actually to our participants online, you can start asking questions in the Q&A function already, because we've got a few minutes before the Q&A session starts. So you can already get in there and then get your questions already written up. But so now, instead of passing over the same question to Marija and Tanja, I thought I'd ask a different question instead, which focuses more on the human rights aspect in a way as well. Of media repression. And so my question is that at the moment in the EU, what we're seeing is this very much a often state-sponsored repression of independent media via kind of these more subtle, as it were, tools. For example, removing broadcasting licenses, claiming, as Mike mentioned, these with the tax authorities, these very high fees that forces closures of outlets. But we're still in the Western Balkans seeing what seems to be more also more traditional repression that includes physical threats and violence, etc. And so I'd like to hear a bit more about that actually, and especially how can the safety of journalism and to stop violence, intimidation, how can this be addressed in more of a systematic way? And I thought as well, we've been discussing mainly the local media aspect, but I would also be quite interested to hear a bit about how international media, how the relationship with international journalists and media outlets functions within those countries as well. And I guess also that does, in a way, touch upon disinformation, which you can mention if you'd like, or if you don't like, since it's quite a broad topic. But I thought I'd pass to Marija first, and apologies for the very broad question, but I hope there's a few things that you can tell us about. And I think especially in regards to your research on female journalists and how their treatment is, I think this could be a really relevant point from you, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quickly about those three countries that I feel are getting better in the Western Balkans, and it might be a mistake actually to perceive the region as a monolith. because we first of all had political changes, and that translates in actual changes at the ground. They are not big, they are not substantial, but they are actually in Macedonia, maybe they are substantial. But in Montenegro, since the change of the government, we had the general prosecutor imprisoned, which is huge. We have a prosecutor in Serbia, like the main prosecutor in Serbia, and she does nothing. And she is, but many people think that she is one of the core reasons why, many things when it comes to protection of journalists is not functioning. In Kosovo, maybe Tanja can speak more. BIRN was actually, as media outlet, as NGO, was part of the, worked with government closely on variety of issues, was consulted, was very much consulted, which I think is huge. So in Macedonia, very few attacks, very, like, since they had their horrific change of government, actually Macedonia seems to be doing pretty well, especially in comparison to rest of us, right? And I also have I wanted to say that I have a practical suggestion how actually Americans and Europeans could help journalists in the region, and that is by speak out more. We see in places such as Bosnia, we see in places such as Serbia that when journalists are attacked, it's American embassy that now protects them on Twitter, protects them actually physically, and I think these are the good things. So being more vocal about human rights and about freedom of expression in the context of protection. When it comes to attacks on journalists in the Western Balkans, we see a couple of trends. There is definitely lesser number of serious attacks, I think, in comparison to previous years, with the exception maybe of Albania, where we recently had a killing of a guard who was protecting a TV station, top channel TV station. So the rest of it, I think that is lesser of physical attacks, lesser of severe physical attacks, but we definitely see the increase when it comes to attacks online. Which we also see, and I think it's a positive thing, is that places such as Bosnia, Macedonia, Serbia, there are designated people in prosecution who are working together with journalists to resolve their predicaments in a quicker way. In Bosnia, that's only, I believe, in the canton of Sarajevo, but it's something. In Serbia, according to statistics that are readily available, we see more cases of attacks on journalists resolved in a quicker way. This is again not to say the situation is perfect; it's far from perfect. The key cases of attacks on journalists are Dragan. In Serbia, we have attacks via SLAP lawsuits. I don't think that any of the countries in Western Balkans has a legal mechanism to address SLAPs. It's not. It's fairly novel in our countries, so that's something that needs to be worked on. When it comes to spaces of attack, I did a couple of researches that show that social media is not only an outlet, but it's also places where the attacks are organized. So we had cases in Bosnia, for instance, where there were open and closed groups of people who were targeting human rights defenders and journalists who were reporting about refugees. In Serbia, we had particularly a brutal case, which was not resolved until now, still isn't resolved, where a group of artists called Momci, they had their exhibition in the center of Zemun, which is very close to, like, part of the Belgrade. And there, on the opening night, the entire show was demolished by men in black who were actually organized in closed and open Facebook groups to do so. So yes, attacks very much migrated on social media, but then also we have absolutely evidence that they migrate from social media into the real life. Female journalists very much attacked throughout the region. Their situation really is not equal as it might be in some other countries. I mentioned that in our research, we demonstrated that women journalists are also perceived as accessory, and that's especially hurtful. And what we mean by that is that we spoke with a couple of female journalists from, I want to say, Albania and Kosovo, and it was suggested to them that they should have a plastic surgery in order to look, more presentable or more appealing than they already are, and so on. And then, yes, there is a big Russian influence in parts of in Serbia, parts of Montenegro, parts of Macedonia, Republic of Srpska. When it comes to Serbia and mostly Republic of Srpska, most of it is actually, not most of it, at least half of it is domestically produced, is in-house produced by tabloids and the media that is close to the government for their own purposes. But then obviously we have Sputnik, we have RT that is readily available. We have RT Balkans that is in works. Yeah. And then one of the main problems is actually that media throughout the region perceives Sputnik, and now I'm not sure if I will pronounce it correctly, but the Chinese the government mouthpiece, they pronounce both as wire agency, as credible source of information. So, and so on and so on. I hope I covered some of the questions that you ask. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. You definitely covered quite a few of the points. So Tanja, passing to you the same question now with the same broad, different areas.
Yeah, well, maybe from that broad question, I can actually talk about the experience of our organization, because as I said, we run investigative center in Belgrade, in Serbia. I can say that we are in very similar situation, and as Marija mentioned, now that our NGO, our sister organization in Kosovo, is actually quite often consulted with the government. So basically 10 years ago, we were in the same position. So we were able to ask government for the consultancy, for the information, for them to be our sources and to answer our questions. And in the meantime, everything was closed, practically closed. We are having very hard time to get officials to talk to us in public, to give official statements, to release the documents, especially that are more sensitive, like tracing budgetary funds, like tracing public procurements, like documents from court cases, from criminal court cases. So basically, our journalists and editors have really hard time to write their stories if they don't have access and proofs for what they are writing about. We also see quite a big decline in our FOIA requests, and even though we have this right for more than 15 years now, now we rarely use it because we know from the start that we are not going to get answers on documents. We also engage, or we expect that we will need to do some sort of risk management campaigns every time our investigative stories is published. What I mean by that is that we basically expect, as a rule, that every time we publish a story, there will be a public campaign, either against our organization, either against the editors or journalists who wrote the story. These public campaigns are especially problematic because they're run by the highest government officials, and it really puts us on the spotlight in a very inconvenient position. We're also in these public campaigns very often labeled as liars or traitors, or the ones that are working towards toppling down the Serbian government in favoring of the foreign interests, particularly because we are financed by foreign donations. Many of these donations actually come from the EU or EU countries. And that's always an argument to label us as traitors. We also recently got sued. These are in our mind, slap load suits. We have currently 4 of them ongoing. 2 of them are from Belgrade Mayor, Aleksandar Šapić, as we wrote about his houses and his finances, and 2 other are from Predrag Kuluvija, who is now on trial for being the biggest manufacturer of marijuana in our country. We still have to see the outcome of this of these lawsuits, but we do feel that they are slaps. They're actually trying to stop our reporters from doing their job. Also, threats that are present in digital space. I think that's now like a normal thing to say, or that we have pure vulgarism or verbal threats, even in some severe cases, hate speech and organized trolling. So when these situations occur, usually what we do is basically try to communicate it, to go public. We don't want to hide any of these situations. We want to use all the legal mechanisms to protect ourselves, and we are definitely trying to get the support, not just from the legal teams, but also from the journalistic community, to somehow raise the solidarity among the colleagues, among journalistic associations, international communities, and so on, just to get some sort of public support and support to what we work on.
Thank you very much for that, Tanja. And since it's just past 4 o'clock, I'm now officially opening the Q&A to the audience in case anyone wants to ask any questions. So again, you can either write your question in the Q&A box, or you can put up your hand essentially, and then I can pass the floor to you so you can ask the question directly out loud to our panel. And so I'd like to say thank you very much for the discussion so far. I think we've touched on quite a few of the really important issues that's been going on. And I already have a question that's come in that I'll pass to the group, as it's not addressed to a specific speaker. But it says, in March, a group of journalists were attacked in Banja Luka while they were covering an LGBTQI+ event. Have the aggressors been identified, or has any action been taken? And I thought to also widen the question a little bit, I'd like to also, from my side, ask, are there any topics in particular where journalists are more facing harder levels of repression or attacks, etc., etc.? So is it particularly, for example, LGBTQI+ issues, or is it also, for example, I know previously there would be attacks, many attacks, for example, in the Netherlands, using an example from the EU, about COVID. There are suddenly like spikes in attacks against journalists for that particular topic. So I was curious to know if there's any, what kind of topics are the most attacked against, etc., in the Western Balkans at the moment. And I thought I would pass first to Dragan for a short answer to that question from the Serbian perspective.
I can answer in a, let's say, broader way, because of this kind of program of major or mainstream media controlled by the authorities, which means authoritarian culture, authoritarian agenda, everything which drift apart, be it reconciliation or coming to the terms with the responsibility for the war crimes in 90s, or speaking about position of certain minorities, be it sexual minority or ethnic minority, or having a different view about Russian aggression on Ukraine, this and that, that people, or that that politicians, or that media, independent media, will be blasted, even attacked physically. So this is a part of this, unfortunately, a very deeply ingrained pattern which exists in the Balkans. I could say specifically in Serbia, but to some extent in other countries. And for that reason, we need not to speak and to tackle on the periphery problem and to do this and that, but we have to tackle the core of the problem, how to change this political environment which would lead to more tolerance, more flexibility and understanding, leading to ethnic reconciliation, reconciliation between different kinds of majorities and different kinds of minorities in any societies, between different societies in the Balkans. And that's which unfortunately, that's something we do not see and witness at this point. And for that reason, I repeat myself, the media situation now is even worse to some extent in the 90s, and overall political situation is even worse than in the 90s. If there is no NATO in the Balkans, and the things, the very fact that all of these nations and states are so exhausted by the wars in the 90s, I think they will go easily to fight again as they fight. When you see this rhetoric, you will understand what I'm saying. You know, for example, at the beginning of 2000, many people in Serbia come to terms that in Srebrenica, were committed appalling crime, genocide. Now, and even the Republika Srpska government accepted a survey about this report in 2004. Now they denied it. They rejected it. So there are different kinds of conspiracy theories in this and that. So if I may just add to this. So as I said, I really appreciated very, very hard work and brave work of our colleagues working in the field in very difficult circumstances. But it would not change the situation substantially. Why? Because unfortunately, their impact is quite limited. As the impact of my company, Radio Free Europe, is, I would say, relatively limited compared to the impact of nationwide media. Why? Because in the Balkans, still TV is the most popular media, in spite of the spread of internet and so on and so on. And in addition, this fact that there are independent media in Serbia, in Bosnia, and other authorities use as a proof that they are democratic. They're democratic. Even Milosevic used, for example, famous B92 as a proof that he's not dictator. But B92 was limited just to be listened in Belgrade. So this is the and one more point we need to take into account. We are forgetting that the social media and people who are, listeners or watchers or whatever, who are very active on social media, and unfortunately in the Balkans, very active on social media, people who are angry, who are not tolerant, and who are blasting in the most bizarre way people who are authors of certain piece or politicians and whatever. And they are so active that they are creating kind of public sphere in itself, or kind of additional alternative media markets. For example, I could speak about the experience of myself or my company. So could you imagine who is most active on our websites in terms of commenting in this? More than 90% they are nationalists and others who are blasting me as an author or blasting people I'm mentioning in that piece. So the question is whether this original piece has more influence on the public audience, or people who are reading these comments, few hundred of them, they are influenced by the comments of the, and the paradox is that our content is, what is kind of content, and people who are blasting it is on the opposite side. So the question is, for people who are coming to see this piece, is this original content more influential, has more influence, or the comments of that people? So, and unfortunately, this is quite unregulated sphere, out of control, and in addition, it's somehow fostered and strengthened or facilitated by different, Tanja mentioned the different kind of bots and trolls and so on. Opposition parties or NGOs definitely not doing that, but it was ruling parties that who are somehow recruiting these bots who are commenting and blasting, and even famous Peščanik was out of the air for a few days, a few years ago, because of this kind of attack on them. So that's the answer. Journalists will be under attack, or anyone who has different opinion, alternative opinion, who's calling for the reason, as long as we have a atmosphere of impunity for whatever wrongdoings in 90s, for whichever kind of wrongdoings now, which are unfortunately pretty rampant. And again, we are coming to the question, what can be done and how the EU and the United States could help in that regard. And to say again, of course, financial assistance is very important, helping in education of young journalists, this and that, but it would not substantially change the situation as long as the core of the problem would not be tackled.
Thank you very much for that answer. And just picking up on the point that you were making to do with basically social media, or the way in which there is a change in tone between new forms of media and the more traditional forms of media, I'd like to actually ask the second question that came in from our audience to Mike, which this question is about the trust towards media outlets and journalists from citizens. And I thought also in that respect, I would be interested in terms of the polarization that there is now and the way in which that works, like polarized societies, basically how they're that is changing also the way in which people use media in certain ways. If yeah.
No, this is a great question, and I saw this question pop up and I immediately pulled up the Balkan barometer data, which I've been digging into a lot recently to kind of see what the public sentiment is in on a lot of stuff. And Dragan had already mentioned this with regards to the EU integration process and sort of this disillusionment with the idea that these countries will ever get into the EU, and frankly, like what the public sentiment is around what the EU really means. And for the vast majority of citizens, it doesn't mean democratization. It means the ability to go work and study elsewhere. And the data on the trust in the media, they have this really interesting question on, do you see the media as independent of political influence? And by and large, no, they see that as these being like inextricably intertwined. And the only country that has a majority saying that there is media independence in the country is Kosovo. But if you look at a country like Montenegro, you have 42% of the respondents saying that no, the media is politically influenced. And I think it gets to this really interesting point that Tanja made earlier about the failure of the business model. I think it ties back to that and how citizens are having a harder time trusting their public institute or their public media, their private media, as a result of the ownership models, right? They know that these models are owned by political and economic elites, and thus it impacts the trust in these institutions. And when you think about solutions, it's really hard to see it other than increased support for public funded media, which is very important. But also I think this question of transparency and how are media outlets speaking about the transparency of their own work and explaining the processes that they go through to do their reporting, I think is really important. And I apologize, but I forgot the second part of your question, if you wouldn't mind repeating that.
Oh, the second part was just about polarization and the way in which, tying to with social media, how the new forms of media are being used.
Yeah, I think the polarization question is really interesting because the media is no longer seen as a service for the public, but rather views the public as the product in many ways. And so often the media is driving content that they think will please their audience. And so it drives them towards the poles of the media and sector, right? instead of providing sort of, fact-based, unbiased comments, they want to feed this engagement on their website. And so you'll see them kind of putting out inflammatory things. Like I think of Georgia as like a really good example of where this happens, where you've just got you've got a lot of media, but they're just so far to one side or the other in terms of the political spectrum in that country. And I know for a fact that this happens elsewhere as well as in the Western Balkans.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. And actually, we've just had another question coming in that's directly citing Marija. And so the question is about Macedonia. So it's asking, how is the situation in Macedonia better than in other Western Balkan countries? And there is a bit of context about how the EU was helping media in Macedonia, but it's not the case anymore. And the sector has changed since then. And there's a mention of the US as well. So I hope that this question makes sense to you and that you can answer it.
Yeah, and I hope that my esteemed panelists will also chime in and speak about Macedonia as well, if they could. But before that, let me answer the question that was actually asked at the beginning, because I know the answer to it. So Vanja Stokić, E-Trafika from Bosnia, and Aidan Kamber, Deutsche Welle, were two journalists attacked on the night in Banja Luka recently, on the night when the Pride Parade was discussed in Banja Luka. I am 99% sure that this case is not resolved. If it is, or it's close to be resolved, it's not been publicly said so. So I think it's not. Furthermore, Vanja Stokić is one of the journalists in Banja Luka, Republic of Srpska, that is often targeted by various actors. And maybe 3 years ago, she received horrible death threats by a known person. That case is still not resolved. So judging by the fact that a very complicated and serious case involving Vanja is not resolved, my suspicion is that this one is still waiting to be resolved. And if I'm not mistaken, those people actually said that they are not feeling safe in Banja Luka anymore, at least for the time being, because police, when they came to the scene, they said that they cannot guarantee them safety. And this should be actually viewed in a context of the fact that the main person in the Republic of Srpska, Mile Dodik, said recently that he is contemplating on introducing the foreign agent law, which we have in countries like Russia. And I think this law is maybe somebody on the panel knows better than I do, but I think that law is still sort of live. It's been discussed, and journalists such as Vanja working independently and in activism, or Deutsche Welle, we have very complicated ways of going forward if the law is indeed to be adopted or implemented. That's possibly part of the answer why I think that Macedonia is doing a bit better than Bosnia. Granted, Macedonia started very low, with Gurevsky government spying on half of their citizens, journalists included. So from there, they, it's very nice that they went climbing on the, measurables and charts. My sense is also that in Macedonia, independent media can actually reach the public, which is not quite the case in Serbia, as explained by Tanja and Dragan. In Serbia, for instance, there is not a single national TV that is not co-opted. So perception is that I think that probably less than 30% of Serbians can actually see news that is other than whatever the government is telling them that is happening. So yes, in comparison to attacks, in the types of attacks that we see in Albania, that we see in Kosovo, that we see in Serbia, I think Macedonia is doing comparatively well, and by the fact that actually independent information is more readily available. And I, of course, agree that the state of the profession is quite fragile, that independent media is underfunded, with some exceptions, that there is a lot of commercialization. But yes, I hope that I explained it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And as one last question before we wrap up for final thoughts, there was a question that's about the Serbian context, which I thought Tanja might be able to answer for us, which is about, do you think that academies and the universities in Serbia have enough strength and resources to bring about some change in the future? And are they in deeper crisis than the media? So I feel like it's not fully on the media side, but I think there's also very much this tie between information and freedom of information within the academic context, which might be possible if you have a minute or two to discuss this. And also if you wanted to touch upon any of the other questions that have already been mentioned, if you have any thoughts to do with the level of trust towards media, or the type of topics that are most under threats, and about Macedonia as well, please feel free to answer those.
Yeah. Maybe I can share a little notes about the previous questions. The one about the trust, there was like maybe 2 years ago a panel about how Serbian people who are computer literate, how they use online news. And one of the questions was, would you rather let algorithm to select your news, or you would rather have editors do it for you? And the majority was, we would rather have algorithms select our news, because they perceive editors and newsrooms as highly biased and highly propagandistic. As far as the situations which are pretty triggering towards the safety of journalists, I would say the question about Banja Luka Pride was very similar in Belgrade. So anytime we have LGBT protests, or lately the ecological environmental protests as well, because in the several years ago, they really start, the eco movement really start to gain the momentum. These are the situations that are pretty critical for the reporters, as we usually after that have reports about some of them being physically attacked, or their equipment ruined, or similar things. And of course, it is quite important what kind of topics do you cover, what kind of topics do you report on. As Dragan mentioned, past reconciliation, war crimes, as well as corruption, organized crimes. These are the topics that you can almost with certainty expect that you will have some sort of intrusion on your professional integrity, on your personal life, on your finances, or any of the weak spots that could be targeted. As far as the academia goes, I would say this is just my impression, personal impression, is that the academic liberties and freedom of expression in general are equally in danger as the media freedoms. In the situation that we have now, with such a strong grip of authoritarian regime on all sectors of our life, and the political and social life, it is hard to expect that academia will have more freedoms than the others. There were no, as far as we have information in public space, there were no clear censorship practices in the university or in the academia, which doesn't actually mean that some other more hidden but more effective mechanisms were in place, like cutting the finances, or denying some information, or doing some work on university was not in danger. I hope I answered that question. If not, I will try. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tanja. Yes, you definitely did. And we only have a few minutes left, so I was wondering if we could maybe go around the speakers, and if you could give a 1 minute or 2 minute comment about anything that you feel like might have been missed, or some kind of conclusion statement. That would be very, very good, because we only have 5 minutes left, but it'd be nice to hear from you all one last time. So I will start with Marija.
Oh, thank you. I actually wrote a couple of sentences on that particular subject, but I'm sorry that we didn't speak more about ways we can actually engage EU and the US in bettering the situation of journalists. In my notes I have sanctions. So, for instance, Dodik mentioned recently from Republika Srpska, he's subject of the he's under US sanctions at the moment, and not just him, but the businesses that are aligned with him, including ATV, which is a TV station in Banja Luka that is perceived to be, you know, basically peddling his propaganda. So I think that's one intriguing way of maybe dealing. I'm not saying censor all the media, but just rethink all the tools that you have in your disposal. Also, there is very interesting initiative that came from CRTA. CRTA is a Belgrade-based NGO. They were actually looking into percentages of foreign companies that are advertising in tabloids and in media that is basically in captured media, and there are astonishing results, basically in demonstrating that American companies and EU companies are financing propaganda in Serbia, and I think that's something that should be absolutely explored further. We need to push those companies, you know, to be more mindful about where they advertise. I know it's not a simple solution, but it is one of the solutions. EU and US needs to push back to our corrupt governments. Sometimes they look too cozy to them. Promote, defend democracy, freedom of media. Promote even full-throatedly, more loudly on social media and in you know, speaking. Fund independent media. I think that's is necessary, goes without saying. Promote the annual human rights report. I'm a big fan of Radio Free Europe, Voice of America. They truly are in parts of the Balkans independent voices. So yes, that would be me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now pass straight to Dragan now for hopefully a 1 minute summary conclusion statement. Thanks very much.
Okay, very quickly. We need to see this situation, the problems with the media, as a part of a wider problem of the crisis of liberal democracy and kind of decline in the faith of liberal democracy and the rise of different kinds of populist and authoritarian governance. So part of the solution for media freedom is also somehow reviving the belief and trust in liberal democracy, is the first point. Second point, while the media is very important as a kind of public guardian and sentinel, and also to keep in check the government and powerful people overall, we cannot expect and being unrealistic and expecting of media and journalists to be Superman, while you know putting away uninformed other sectors of the society. For example, for creating public opinion is not, while media is very important, but our values are also pretty much influenced by educational system. And there's another topic to speak about, the quality of history, textbooks in the Balkans and so on. So we need to be realistic. So the media reform and improving the position of media is not possible without improving other aspects, particularly political environment. And for that reason, we are mentioning how, in which way the EU and the United States could approach. So they cannot approach just in an isolated way and helping media sector while keeping intact absolutely other aspects, pushing for the political change, for democratic change, and so on. So I think it needs to be simultaneously processed. The only way to help, to improve media position and position of independent media, and to change overall media environment in the Balkans.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dragan. And I will pass straight to Tanja before then to Mike.
Yeah, in terms of some conclusions and maybe offer some solutions, I'm thinking that at the level of media organizations, at the level of newsrooms, I would really like to see colleagues to pay more attention on the ethics and professional standards, because these are the ones that actually protect the integrity of the profession itself, and not raising the questions, why do we need them at all. I would also suggest to always increase knowledge, share knowledge, increase safety standards, and we always have to be in this learning loop as the digital technologies, new technologies are constantly making shifts in content creation, content distribution, and so on. And also to work on ownership, transparency, several times mentioned here as well. At the level of the government, I would really like to see push in regulatory reforms, increase the standards of regulatory safeguards. We talked a lot about, like long-standing problems, but the new problems that are emerging from the digital environment, platforms, social media landscape. This is something that we still have to resolve and come up with some protection mechanism. And as far as EU, USA support, as Marija mentioned, many of them, I won't repeat those, but it is really crucial for these international actors that have actually some sort of leverage to push the media freedoms higher on the agenda and not let them slip for the cause of stability or some other issues that are constantly emerging. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And on to Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. And sitting here just outside Washington, D.C., I'm just really grateful to be a part of this. And I want to say this is a conversation that should continue. And in a shameless self-promotion plug, our new Nations in Transit report comes out in 3 weeks, in which we're going to be talking about a lot of these issues. And so I hope all of you will join us, and that we can continue this conversation and get really to the bottom of these problems, because as the other panelists have said, this is not just an issue of media freedom. It really connects to the broader democratic problems that we've seen throughout this region and throughout the world. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And the shameless plug was fine. So, so even though it would be really, really great to continue this conversation, we're already past the hour. And even though I still have many questions that I'd like to ask you, I think we're going to have to end the event now. So on behalf of the European Policy Centre, I would like to thank all of our panelists very, very much, and also to our project partners, the US mission to the EU. So Mike, Marija, Dragan, and Tanja, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experience. And hopefully there will be a part 2, or at least we can continue this conversation in other ways. I would also like to send a thank you to my EPC colleagues, particularly Berta Lopez-Dominguez and Marta Musnik from the EPI team, and our events and communications team for making all of this possible. And a thank you very much to our audience as well, and apologies for anyone who questioned we didn't get to, but thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for your questions and for taking part. So have a very nice afternoon, everyone, and thanks again to our panelists and our attendees. Have a very nice afternoon, and hopefully see you soon at another one of our events.
Thank you. Bye-bye.